Welcome everyone to this session for Microsoft Build, where we will teach you how to build GraphQL on top of Microsoft Azure. I'm Adrian Hall. I'm a product manager for Azure API Management. With me today, Davide Mauri and Thomas Gauvin, who are from Azure SQL and Azure Static Web Apps, respectively. A quick look at what we're going to be talking about today. The first thing, we're going to give you a very, very short introduction to GraphQL, why we think it's great, what it's for. Then we're going to talk about how we're going to run GraphQL on Azure, and we're going to talk about the principal ways that we think you should be running GraphQL. And finally, there's options here. So which one should you use? That's a great question, and we'll cover that at the end. So the really short version of GraphQL and why we like it. Definitions aside, if you go onto the GraphQL website, GraphQL is a standard produced by a foundation, originally by Facebook, but now it's run by a foundation. GraphQL is a query language for APIs. I don't actually like this definition, and I'm pretty sure you guys either. To my mind, GraphQL is a mechanism, a protocol for allowing clients to talk to servers in a standardized way, and it provides them with three things. The first thing is every single request is complete. So you don't have to do multiple requests. That does have the added advantage that if you need to split up your request for example, efficiency, you want to multi-thread your data transfers, you can do it any which way you want. You don't have to be constrained by the server. The second thing is the client asks for exactly what they want. That's, we're not wasting bandwidth receiving data for things that we're just going to toss out because it's not in the page drawer. And the third thing is a very underrated part of the GraphQL specification is subscriptions. And subscriptions are real-time notifications, and that allows the applications to be reactive. Aside from that, the GraphQL schema is designed to be evolvable over time, and there's really good, powerful developer tooling. We actually, GraphQL actually exposes the schema as part of an introspection service, and that can be used by the tooling to get really good client level capabilities. What does a example look like? We'll actually be looking at this example a little later in a demo, but there's a query language which allows you to ask for exactly what you want. So for example, in this case, I'm asking for all the films of the Star Wars film library, and give me their ID and title, and also give me the main characters with their ID and name associated with those films. And as you can see on the right-hand side, we get exactly that information, even though there's much more information about the characters, where they're from, who played them, that sort of thing. That is not included because we don't need it for this render. So would I use GraphQL over some of the other API types? OpenAPI has become very popular. RESTful APIs are very popular. There's also other ones like gRPC, WebSockets, SignalR. Those are other options. The advantages of GraphQL are all on the client side. First of all, you can specify exactly what you need, no more, no less. It's very performant as a result. Those larger data blocks, rather than being multiple requests that are much smaller, which are harder to compress, single request, larger data blocks, easier to compress. You can be very flexible. The client can change without the server changing. That's wonderful. And there's lots of great client implementations. GraphQL does have some disadvantages though, and I would only use it for client to service communications. The biggest one is the single endpoint. All GraphQL requests go through a single endpoint, which means you can't fan it out as you would a RESTful API where you've got lots of microservices, for example. Security, big problem. This is an emerging area, but again, because of that single endpoint, because the entire schema is available, you've got unique security concerns. GraphQL does cost more to run. I don't think that can be understated here. Is it a big difference? No, it's not, but it is a difference, and it does, at scale, cost does become an implementation detail. And the server implementation is much more complex. Mostly that's because GraphQL splits everything into resolver units. And the resolver is just like a REST endpoint. Each resolver is very, very simple, but you've got to combine all these together. There's a design process, there's making it work together, there's reducing the number of resolver executions. All of this comes into the complexity of the server. So how do you run GraphQL on Azure? There are 3 options. Number 1, host it yourself. Always a good option, but we say protect it as well, and we'll talk about that. The second option and the third option are brand new. Firstly, synthetic GraphQL. This is a feature of Azure API Management that allows you to turn your REST, SOAP, and HTTP APIs into GraphQL. No intermediary required. You just modernize your API, keep your old REST and SOAP APIs, and just put a GraphQL facade on top. That's great if you know your schema and if you've got a set of resolver HTTP APIs sitting there. But if you've only got a database and you want to create a GraphQL schema on top of that database, the Data API Builder is the way to do it, and we'll talk about that third. So let's start with hosting it yourself. You can run your GraphQL service on any of our hosting platforms. Now, Apollo Server and Chili Cream Hot Chocolate have explicit support for Azure Functions so that you can run your GraphQL service serverlessly. Everything else can run on anything from a VM up to an app service, container apps, Kubernetes service. You can be in a secure enclave with ACE. You can be in the public internet with a normal app service. If your choice is Data API Builder, you can run that here as well. There's no problem there. What we do recommend is that you protect your service with Azure API Management. Azure API Management is designed to protect HTTP APIs, and GraphQL is a HTTP API. There are security concerns around rate limiting, around concurrency checks to make sure that you aren't doing it, or someone else isn't doing a denial of service against your service. You've got authorization checks, content validation to make sure that things are going to be secure. Finally, there's GraphQL specific support within Azure API Management for per field authorization, query complexity control, and introspection control. So, for example, introspection is a great feature in a developer environment. When you go to production, you probably want to turn it off. Whilst it's not necessary, I mean, you can always work out what fields are going to be supported. Introspection just gives that easy on switch of being able to do that. So being able to turn it off is a great production feature. How do we recommend that you host it? Now, first of all, in any enterprise environment, put your actual service in a VNet. Now, make sure that only your security edge devices or services are able to access that GraphQL service. And then front it with API management, and before that, front door. Front door gives you your standard HTTP protection. Azure API Management gives you your specific HTTP API and GraphQL protection, and then it hits your GraphQL service, and only good requests are hitting your service. So let's talk about the second option, which is synthetic GraphQL. Synthetic GraphQL allows you to compose a GraphQL API from your existing REST, SOAP, and other HTTP APIs. It allows you to migrate to GraphQL slowly whilst keeping your investment in your REST APIs, SOAP APIs available. One of the good things here, backends for your front ends is a thing. It's a very common architecture pattern. So being able to say, hey, here are my data sources, REST, SOAP, whatever, here's my GraphQL facade for my specific application. Here's a different GraphQL facade for a different application. You can get your backend for your front end easily. One of the nice things is we support real-time subscriptions out of the box. Now that means it doesn't really matter whether your backend has real-time or not. Now, Microsoft Graph, as a for example, no real-time capabilities there. You just have to do a query request response. We can actually layer on top of that subscriptions such that when you do a request through GraphQL, the GraphQL subscriptions all get notified of that change. And finally, we do have some great production-ready GraphQL features with API management features. Things like per-field authorizations are built in. How would you implement it? Oops. I'm going to go back. How would you implement it? Exactly the same way. We start with front door at the front for protecting your HTTP API, private link that to API management. That is where your GraphQL endpoint is. Now, the API management can be inside of a VNet or outside of a VNet, and all of your REST and SOAP services are wherever they're located. So if you happen to be using Microsoft Graph, great, we can support that. If you're running a microservice architecture inside of a container app or inside of a Kubernetes service, great, we can do that. App service, VMs, doesn't matter. So with that, I am going to switch over to my demo. So what I have here is an API management service. This happens to be a developer SKU. Synthetic GraphQL is available on all the SKUs except for the self-hosted gateway. And I'm going to go over to my APIs list, and I've already got a synthetic GraphQL mostly set up. This is based on the Star Wars dataset, which is a standard dataset for anyone that's learned GraphQL. And you can see straight away that the schema, which is so central to the way that GraphQL works, is the schema is front and center. Now, there's a couple of interesting features here. First of all, I can right-click on any type, and I can go to definition, and I can peek the definition. And if I peek the definition, it will actually put it right in line for me. If I can close that. But let's scroll down to the bottom, and we'll show you how to create a resolver. So I've got get film by ID. Now you notice I've connected up most of these. I can click on add a resolver, and it will give you a blank resolver associated with the specific field that I clicked on. I'm just going to copy my resolver because I can never type correctly. And this uses a standard policy language for API management. You can see that this is very, very basic. There's a HTTP request that says this is the get of a specific URL. You can add headers in. You can add authorization capabilities in. You can also modify what is coming back from the service to match what the schema requires. So clicking on that, I'll just create it, and that is enough to create a resolver. Now I can click on test, and that will bring up our test console, which I've got here. And I can actually build a query. So if we remember from our demo, I wanted to get the films with the title and the ID. And I also wanted to get the characters, and I get the ID and the name. Now what this will do behind the scenes is it will first send a REST API to my endpoint to say, give me a list of all the films. There's 6 films in my universe. I haven't added the 7, 8, 9 yet. But then I further say, give me a list for each film. Give me a list of the characters. And what comes back is a list of IDs. And then I say, for each character, give me a list of give me the name of the character. So running that quickly, that's going to go out. And if you think about it, 6 films, each film has 20, 30 different characters, and each character has its own call to get there. So you're talking about 150, 160 something different REST API calls. And you can see it comes back really quickly. That's because we do a lot of caching behind the scenes. So, for example, Anakin Skywalker is in multiple films. We only request once. No matter how many times that data is requested, we just cache it internally. So that's great for synthetic GraphQL. We can build up our API. We can use REST and SOAP APIs to do that. We can modify the output. We can also link it to subscriptions and authorize the content. What happens if you're not that familiar with GraphQL schemas, but you've got a database that you want to expose? David.
Thanks, Adrian. I'm super happy of what you have just shown, and also something that I would like to show to you and to everyone watching this video about Data API Builder. So Data API Builder is a project that lives in the open source, so it's completely open. It's released under the MIT license that takes your relational or non-relational database and make it an API, a REST or a GraphQL API. And specifically here we're interested in GraphQL, so I will be focusing on that more, but I just want to know that we take care of everything. Again, all the most common, as you mentioned before, HTTP protocols, but here we will be focusing on GraphQL. So what happens is that Data API Builder will read your relational schema or a GraphQL schema if you are using a NoSQL database like Cosmos DB, and a configuration file. The configuration file is what contains all the information about what you want to expose and how and which security permission level. This means that we don't touch your database at all. Your database remains untouched, so there is no need to create tables or views or store a procedure with specific names or even to create anything. You just configure the configuration file and you're good to go. So let me show you. I have a pretty cool demo too. So let's say that I'm also a science fiction fan, and I created a couple of tables as an example, the series and the books table. And of course, series contains information about the series of the books I'm reading, and the books is about the books that I have in my library. And as you can see here, the series contains information about the name of the series, like Foundation by Isaac Asimov or Hyperion Cantos, and here all the books that are related to that specific series. Now, I want maybe Thomas to build a nice front end for my database using a full stack or jump stack pattern, or as you mentioned, a backend for front end pattern. And my interest is just to make as soon as possible the tables or the views or the store procedure or the collection available to Thomas to build a nice front end. So the only thing I need to do once I have my table or views or store procedure done here, let me switch to Visual Studio Code, and I just need to create a configuration file. I have one ready already, but let's start from the scratch. And the first thing I have to do is install Data API Builder, is .NET tool install, and then basically that's all you need to do in order to install Data API Builder on your machine. And once you have done that, so I'm not doing it right now because I already done, you just have to initialize the configuration file with something like dub init. Dub is the name of the CLI we provide for the API Builder, the database I want to use, in this case Microsoft SQL Server, and then a connection string. I'm using an environment variable for obvious security reason. And then the only thing I have to do is dub add, and for example, I'm adding the series table to my configuration file. So I'm adding all my series table and with a specific permission in this case that I want anyone to be able to do anything on this object I'm going to expose as a REST and GraphQL endpoint. So this means that for GraphQL we'll be creating queries and mutation. Of course, you can change your permission to make sure that they fit what you want to have in terms of security, and that's why right now I am, using this configuration file just for demo purposes, but I will be switching to another I already prepared that is much more richer and more close to real-world scenario. But as you can see, creating the configuration file is super simple. And if I want to start my application right now, my server serving the REST and GraphQL API, the only thing I have to do is here do dub start, and that will start everything. But before doing that, let me remove this sample file I created and use the one that I already prepared. And let's go over together this file here. So as you can see, we have a lot of information about the runtime. Here we are enabling GraphQL because that's what we want to focus on today. And here, as you can see, I have my entities. Entities are the most important part of the configuration file because it tells Data API Builder what table, view, store, procedure, or collection you want to expose, in this case as GraphQL entities. And this is the name of the entity I'm going to expose. This is the database object behind the scene, and as you can see here I have permission, the one that I defined before, and very, very important for GraphQL, relationship. My series should allow me to navigate into the books that belongs to that series. In GraphQL it's great as it allows to have this kind of navigation relationship and compose a complex query that would, as Adrian was mentioning before, will help me to make better use of mobile battery, for example, on mobile phone, don't use too much bandwidth, and so on and so forth. So I need to define my relationship, and that's what I'm doing here. So I just need to start Data API Builder, and let's start from a clean console, and let's just do dub start. This is starting up, and everything is working already. As you can see now, my server is listening to the port 5001. And in fact, I can go here and I have my, in this case, GraphQL playground available to query and play with the data. We are using Hot Chocolate behind the scene. So this is the playground provided by Hot Chocolate. As you can see, I am typing my query and I can just run it and I have the answer. Now, what happens if I want to get all the books of my series? Well, given the fact that GraphQL supports relationship and I configured my relationship, as you can see now from series, I can ask the books and then inside, as Adrian showed before, only the thing I'm interested in. I can even filter, paginate, sort, or even project only the field I need. So Data API Builder provides a full CRUD implementation, and as just mentioned, not only we support reading, but also creating, updating, and deleting via mutation the entities. So now I can just run this, and as you can see now, all my books are returned. This is basically everything about the Data API Builder. You can go to aka.ms/dab and download the source code, get the NuGet package, or just install using .NET Tool, and then just start to use Data API Builder. Now, if you are wondering, well, does it only work on premises, which is great because as a developer, for example, I love working offline and then being able to push everything on Azure. So if you're wondering if that works on Azure, yes, of course. Right, Thomas?
Yeah, absolutely. So for this demo, I sort of worked off of your demo, Davide. I have a database with a table with books, and then I have the table of their authors. And then I have that configured with foreign keys. And so what we're going to do is we're going to display these within our application and add a little bit of CRUD goodness to that. Okay, so let me just pull up my VS Code right now. What I'll do is I'll show you just how easy it is to enable database connections on a static web app. Let me close some consoles over here because I have a lot of clutter. So here I have a typical React application. I called it library demo, and then within here I have a few pages to show my library, so my books and my authors. What I'm going to do is I'm going to initialize the database connection on this static web app project. In order to do that, I'll be using the SWA CLI because we built the DAB integration right into the SWA CLI. So in order to do this, I'll do SWA DB init to initialize the connection, and then I'll pass the database type. In this case, I'm using MSSQL, basically your database.
Yep.
And then what I'll do is I'll also pass a connection string, and then in my case, I'll also refer to that environment variable. Basically, it is the same thing as what you did before, Davide. With this SWA CLI command, what we'll see is we just generated a new folder and this configuration file. In this configuration file, we have basic configurations of the database we're connecting to. I've already created that environment variable in my .env file, so I'm not leaking any secrets. And then I have configured my runtime over here. Now, what we can do is go ahead and configure the entities aspect, which entities we want to expose. And I actually have this all pre-configured. So let me jump over to my pre-configured configuration file, and I'll show you the entities that I've exposed. So I have my author entity, and then I pointed it to my authors table. Added a couple permissions. because that's one of the beautiful aspects of static web apps database connections integration with Data API, is that you have the integration with static web apps authorization and authentication. So by using static web apps login and authorization feature, you have access to role-based access control on different actions for these entities. I have the same relationships as you have, and then I've configured that for my books as well. Okay, so let me delete this one that we just created, and then I'll show you how we can start our application with database connections. I already have my React application running, and I'll be using the SWA CLI to point to my React application, but I'll also point to my database connections. So what I'll do is I'll do SWA start and then pass my app dev server URL. And then that's a simple HTTP localhost 3000. And then with data API location, I can indicate SWA-DB connections. In this case, SWA-DB connections archive. OK. Now, just with that, it'll go ahead and spin up and emulate our Azure Static Web Apps environment in the cloud with the emulation of the database connections and then the proxying to our front end. Now, if I go ahead and show you, I'll reload my web application. Here we can see my React application, and it's making these calls to the database connections feature. So if we look at here, I'm making a GraphQL call in order to retrieve the different authors from my database, and I'm making this through GraphQL. And so that's because when I initialized this database connection, I received a series of GraphQL mutations and GraphQL endpoints. Let me go ahead and actually show you that. Once again, with the Data API Builder integration, we have this banana cake pop IDE, so we can see the set of GraphQL queries and mutations. So here I have a set of authors, a set of queries. Here I can call my authors. And I also have a set of mutations where I can do creates, deletes, and updates. And so what I did is I went ahead in my code, and within my author list, I went ahead and wrote my GraphQL. So here I have simple mutations for delete author. Here I'm getting the author, and then I'm just sending that off. In this case, I'm using Apollo client as my library, but you could go ahead and use it however you wanted. What's nice with this is that if I wanted to get the details, once again, I can use the relationships feature from GraphQL and then retrieve an author along with their books. So if we look at our web application once again, if I wanted to get the details for Lewis Carroll, for instance, I can see all of the books that they've written. Now, if we return to our demo, I want to show you how we do the integration with the authorization. So if I go to the create author, I left the create option as something that only admin users could do. So for instance, here, when I'm sending off this mutation, I'm actually passing in that header, and I can specify that I want to use the admin role in order to create that author in this case. Now, the best part of all of this is that this deployment with static web apps and database connections is super easy. What we can do now is just do a simple git, add, commit, add all of our changes, and then that'll be pushed to my GitHub. I already created a static web app for this example. So what I'll do is I'll git add everything, and then git commit, and then let's just do simple session, and then git push. All right. So with that, I'll be able to see within my GitHub that this is going to be triggering an action, and then this is going to be deploying this new code to my static web app. And on the flip side, within my static web app, I can go ahead and add the database connection to indicate which Azure resource I want to connect to. So within the database connection tab, you can see in this case, I already have it connected. But I want to show you just how easy it is to link because we worked really hard on this. So from here, you can go ahead and choose the database you want to link to. So in this case, it's an Azure SQL. But like you saw, we support Cosmos DB for NoSQL, MySQL, PostgreSQL. And then we'll go ahead and select the resource group, the resource name, the database, and then I'll just pass in my authentication type. In this case, I'm using connection string, but if you have a standard queue static web app, you can use managed identity. And so with this, I'll go ahead and link, and I want to show you that just like that, I can head on over to my deployed static web app, refresh the page, and then I'm making those GraphQL and REST API calls to my serverless data API builder, database connections backend. So if I load that back up right now, it'll load instantaneously. We're once again making that GraphQL call and then just rendering that in a React application.
Wow. Amazing.
Nice.
Yeah. So just like that, we essentially built this application very quickly.
Yeah.
And with database connections and data API builder, we get all of that productivity under the hood because we have filtering and sorting, and we have the integration with authorization, and you no longer have to build a tedious and complex data access backend. You get that all out of the box with database connections and data API builder.
Fantastic.
Nice.
Okay, so I know that we mentioned at the beginning that we wanted to talk about when to use which options. So let me pull up my slides, and then we can talk about that a little bit.
Yep.
All right, so how do we choose the right method?
That's right.
To my mind, synthetic GraphQL is great when you have more complex needs, when you have existing REST and SOAP APIs that you want to modernize, and when you want to integrate explicitly things like Microsoft Graph or Dataverse into the process. Multiple data sources, enterprise data model, complex requirements.
Yeah.
That's not every single project.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I think instead Data API Builder is great if you want to have the fastest time to value. So you have a database and you want to publish, as I just did with Thomas. You have a single database because we support only one database at a time at the moment. When the schema of the GraphQL, it's okay for you to match exactly the database. That's perfect. And in general, you really want to minimize the boilerplate coding and just go with whatever you have. And also, you have a somehow simple authorization rule. Simple in the sense that we support also row-level security, but of course, whatever you can do with API management is much richer than what we can do in the API Builder, just with the database access. But that's why probably the discussion between which of the two is pointless, I would say. Because
I think that, to be honest, because we can combine the best of both worlds, everything is possible.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
These are just building blocks.
Yes.
These are, if you need to access that data from a database with full paging and searching and sorting, Data API Builder is is the thing. If you want to project that up to combine it with additional data sources, then API management on top of that makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
If you don't need the paging and sorting, you just need to expose your existing APIs, maybe you're layering on top of Microsoft Graph as a for example, then Azure API Management will do it all for you.
Yep.
So any which way will work here.
Yeah.
So let's just take over an example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's,
of course, like you mentioned, you can always start with a basic data-driven web app, right? You can start with your static web app and then use the database connections feature to go ahead and have that CRUD access to a database. But you can definitely take it a lot more complex and a lot more flexible from there, right?
I mean, the common thing is, hey, I've got this data-driven web API.
Yep.
And then, your manager comes around and says, you know what the CEO would like? He'd like a mobile app, please.
That's right.
And you go like, great, what do I do? And because you're now exposing it to the public, because you've got more access mechanisms, you've now got a web app and you've got a mobile app, two different requirements. Honestly, throwing API management on the front of that will now allow you to have subscription key for the mobile app, subscription key for the web app, all going through the same thing. And Static Web Apps has inbuilt support for Azure API Management.
Absolutely.
So you don't have to change anything there.
Yeah.
So that's our next thing. No changes to your website code. It still works. It's wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the second thing is like when that manager comes around again and says, "This is great. We love this, but." That database table? Well, it would be really good if instead of getting the username of whoever updated it, we got all of their Azure Active Directory information. And at that point, you can go like, that's great. That's a synthetic GraphQL. I'm not going to change the Data API Builder bit.
Yeah.
All I'm going to do is I'm going to augment that information with the information from Microsoft Graph using synthetic GraphQL.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So absolutely a wonderful way to do this.
No, and that's perfect because what you just described is how an application can evolve over time, which is great. For example, if I'm a startup and I want to go, as I like to say, from IPO to enterprise, I can just start and evolve, and Azure and our tools are there to support me. So that's great.
Absolutely.
And you know what? I really like the idea of my application evolving over time, because if I'm a startup, I can think to go from IPO to enterprise just by evolving my need, and Azure is there to support that evolution, right? And an additional thing I want to highlight is that Data API Builder is coming to be integrated with API Management too. So all the simplicity that we saw in static apps will also be there in
Azure API Management.
That's great.
So just to close, some further reading for you. Lots of people want to know how to learn GraphQL. I hope that you take away from this session that I need to know GraphQL for my client applications. Learn.graphql.org is the absolute best place to learn that. You'll see the Star Wars dataset featured heavily, and that's the great starting point. For Azure API Management, we've got a couple of links there. The second link there, github.com Azure Samples, is an Azure Developer CLI compatible sample that you can just do AZD up, and it will deploy the Star Wars dataset as a synthetic GraphQL API for you, along with a to-do list and a couple of others.
Nice.
For Data API Builder?
Yeah, for the API Builder, we put a lot of effort in creating the Getting Started guide, both on database connection and Data API Builder itself. So just go to the link you can see right now in the slide, and start to use Data API Builder, static apps, API management all together, and just build the next big thing. Right.
And with that, thank you very much for watching. Adrian Hall,
Davide,
And Thomas.
and we hope you have a great build.
enjoy.